Hi, for those who don't know me, I'm AJ Parr. I'm a journalist, I'm also an author, and I'm a consciousness researcher. I had an amazing experience in 1991. I call it a near death like experience, but I suspect it was a near death experience. However, since I cannot prove that I really died, I stick with the term near death like experience. This began in the middle of the night in the month of April 1991. I suddenly woke up. I found myself in this pitch black darkness. I couldn't see anything. So I raised both my hands. I stared at them, but I couldn't see them. So this was darker than the darkest place I had ever been to. So I looked around, I couldn't see anything, and all of a sudden I woke up in my bed and took a big breath. So I really didn't know what had happened. I had suffered from asthma and I was later diagnosed with sleep apnea. So I think I just simply stopped breathing. But the following night, this happened again. And it actually happened 3 nights in a row. The second night, I woke up in this dark place again. I was surprised. I said, "Hey, what am I doing here again?" So I raised both my hands. I tried to see them and I couldn't. And this time I imagined or I thought, hey, someone could be hidden in this darkness and I would never tell. So the minute I thought that, I got really scared. It's like when a child goes to a dark room, the minute he imagines there could be a monster, he's really scared. So I woke up that second night, took a deep breath. I was wondering what had happened. I had had not quite the same, but I had had more or less similar experiences. When I was a child during an asthma attack, I would be the whole night with difficulties to breathe, and I would end the night simply fainting or falling asleep. And several times I stopped breathing. I did suffer from sleep paralysis. Several times I did find myself in a dark place, but not as dark as this one. Now, the third night, this was what really changed my life. The third night, I woke up again in the same darkness. I raised my hands again. I couldn't see them. It was pitch black. This time I felt a presence, and I was right. I was super scared. You know, when you're scared, you feel in your chest like an emptiness, you know? And I heard a voice that said, "Surrender, all is one." The minute I heard that, I don't know why, maybe I trusted that everything was one, but I relaxed while the sensation that I had in my chest expanded. So I thought to myself, hey, I'm feeling like I'm getting more scared, but actually I'm relaxed. I realized that it was not the sensation of being scared, what I felt in my chest, that my chest was empty. And it grew, and the emptiness expanded and expanded beyond my body, expanded beyond my house, beyond everything I knew. And all of a sudden, I appeared in the middle of what I call a star. This was a body of light that extended in all directions infinitely. I could see up and down, to the right and to the left, in all directions at the same time. This was unbelievable because normally you can only see in front of you, but I could see in all directions. But the interesting part is, since I could see up and down, I could also see the middle, but I was not in the middle. In the middle was this sensation of emptiness and pure light. So when I was there, I really had no thoughts. I didn't remember ever being human, but I did feel that I was the light. And if I focused on the center of the star, I would see the center of the star while also seeing the rest. So I focused on a ray of light, and I noticed that each ray of light was surrounded by other rays, but there was like an empty space between each ray. So the way I can describe it is that I felt that I was occupying an empty space, but I was that empty space, and in the same time, I was the light that was filling the empty space. I felt a sound like wind or maybe thunder. I felt I was one with everything, and I followed each ray of light, and it seemed infinite. I had the sensation that it was as big as the universe, and that I was the only living being there. Like I said, I did not have any thoughts. I simply experienced it. I was like a consciousness. So I stayed there. I don't know how long I stayed there, but this was like a natural place to be. And I don't call it home like many people call it. I didn't give it a name. I simply was there, and that was all that existed. During the time that I stayed there, I felt stronger, mightier than ever. I did feel extreme peace, extreme bliss, and I was overwhelmed. As soon as I woke up in my bed, I took a deep breath. I felt that I had stopped breathing for a long time, and I held my head and said, "Wow, what was this?" I could still feel that I was there. I could still feel that my body was not this body, but that my body was actually like a sphere. I could still perceive in all directions at the same time, the front, the back, sideways. And I could still feel that I was one with everything. So this was really, I didn't know what to think. I got up from my bed alarmed. And the first thing that occurred to me was to place my hand against the wall. So as I pressed my hand against the wall, I felt that I was my hand pressing against the wall, but I could also feel that I was the wall pressing back. So I had this like double consciousness. I was me, but I was also non me. So I couldn't go back to sleep that night. I felt this amazing sensation of oneness, and this lasted for 2 or 3 days. However, as it was fading out, I asked God or the source what had happened. And I got a brief reply in form, and it was more or less like a download, but it was also something that happened and that was completely unexpected. I suddenly felt the presence of a very old man. I could not see him. I felt him. And then I realized he was older than any old man I could ever imagine. I sensed that he was as old as the universe. I really don't know, but he transmitted to me this poem that says like this: In the beginning was the one, but the one was alone, and he wanted to play. So the one divided himself into two and gave number two amnesia, and thus the game began. That was all. I found in that explanation not only the creation story, but also the secret teachings of the world's main religions. Back then, here's a bit of my backstory. Before I had that experience, all my life I had had paranormal or mystical experiences. When I was a kid, I used to dream angels. And after that, when I started having asthma attacks, I would have nightmares. And I learned to wake up in the nightmare and recognize that I was dreaming. This is what they call, I later found out that this is called lucid dreaming. So I would have these like repetitive nightmares until one day I found myself in one of these nightmares and I said, wow, this is exactly what I have experienced in my nightmares. So I must be dreaming. And the moment I realized I was dreaming, I managed to control my dreams. And also, I managed to wake up voluntarily. After that, during my youth, I had involuntary out of body experiences. That was really scary, and I didn't want that. I did not know enough about the subject, so it scared me a lot. And when I was 16, I started to meditate. I met some people who belonged to the Mission of the Divine Light that was founded by Guru Maharaji, and he had some meditation techniques that were really interesting. And he also said something that was really interesting. He said that Jesus, Buddha, and Krishna were avatars and that they were masters. That's when I started thinking that Christianity is not the only way. So I started reading back then mostly stories from India, and I learned about Buddha, and I started learning about the Bhagavad Gita. So all this happened before my actual experience. So when I woke up and experienced and had that oneness experience with the wall, I suddenly realized, I don't know why, I suddenly realized that perhaps that was what Jesus meant when he said, I and the Father are one. Also, he said, I am the light of the world. And the Bible begins when God says, in the beginning was the light. After that, I started reading the Holy Scriptures, trying to find any mention of oneness and the light. So, apart from let there be light and there was light, I found things like God is light and in him there is no darkness. Phrases like, I am in my Father and you are in me and I am in you. Also, the teachings of Jesus say, don't do to others what you would not like others to do to you. So, this sense of oneness, that we are all one, is hidden in Christianity. Also, I took a look at the Bhagavad Gita once more, and I looking for any sign of this mystical light that I had seen or this universal consciousness. And I found in the Bhagavad Gita that it said that the sun is the symbol of the Supreme Self. They call it the Supreme Self or the One Self. That was really interesting. And also, the Bhagavad Gita talked about the unity of all beings and that God is the light of all light, Brahman. They call God Brahman. And this is a formless, energetic being that he can take different forms. Basically, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, the three personalities. But in his original form, he is this abstract oneness. Also in Buddhism, they talk about that everything is one, and they talk about emptiness, that the sunyata, they call it, the natural state of the universe is emptiness. And I realized when I had my experience, in order for the light to exist, it needs to exist somewhere. So the light is filling this emptiness. There has to be an empty space. It's just like when you, in order to fill up a cup of water, the cup needs to be empty. Okay. So more or less that conception is what I found. And looking at other religions, I also found that Rumi talks about the light of Allah. And he mentioned something, you're not a drop of water in the ocean. You are the whole ocean in a drop. So that ideas like that are all over the world's most ancient religions. There was another religion, which is the Chinese. It talks about the Tao or the One. This is really amazing because the Chinese have this book called the Tao Te Ching, and it begins by saying the Tao that you can mention or that you can talk about is not the immortal Tao. It's like saying the God that you talk about is not the real God. So I had that sensation after my experience. And continuing with my spiritual research, which took years, I'm just giving you a summary. One of the most ancient teachings known as the Hermetic teaching. This was founded by Hermes Trismegistus. He was supposed to be alive in ancient Egypt. He was also followed in ancient Greece. And he was the one that created the 7 laws of the universe contained in the Kybalion. And the first law is that the universe is mental and that this reality can be considered part of a universal, infinite, living mind. So basically, what he's saying that God is practically a universal mind. That's more or less what the Hindus said when they mentioned universal consciousness. So I continued researching, and 2 or 3 days after my experience, before I did this research, as soon as I found out, or I had this, I suspected that Jesus had mentioned this basic truth, which is everything is one, and that this oneness takes form of a light. When I realized this, I said, okay, since I'm a journalist, I was trained to write, I have always written. I said, okay, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book about this. And I started writing, taking notes of my experience. But the second night or the third night that I was doing this, I again felt this presence. This is a presence that I cannot describe, but I knew it was mystical or that had to do with God. And I was still holding the pen in my hand. I had a notebook and I was writing. And I heard a question. I was asked why. The question was very simple. Why? And it was it was pronounced slowly and it was really long. Why? And as I heard that word, I thought to myself, oh, wow, he's asking me, why am I seeking the sacred knowledge? Why do I want to give it away in a book? And I answered. I did not pronounce the answer. The answer came out from my chest. I heard myself answering. And the answer was because I want to write a book and be famous. So at that moment, when I heard my answer, I felt so ashamed that I fell on my knees. And I asked God for forgiveness because I knew that you cannot seek the higher knowledge or the spiritual knowledge, or at least that's what I thought back then, that you cannot have a selfish reason to gain this secret knowledge that is reserved for the initiates. So I knew that, the Hermetic teachings are all about being initiated and following a spiritual path, not only through symbols, but through dreams and through mystical experiences. So I fell on my knees and I said, okay, I'm not ever gonna write about it. And I started a long quest that made me realize that all religions had shared the same basic roots, and that my experience had to do with the origin of the world's main religions. I also concluded that a religion does not depend on written words. Many follow a book or many follow the scriptures, but the origin of all religions is an experience. So this was before I ever heard about near-death experiences. So this phase took me around 2 decades, after which I started writing books about the different religions, why they all share the same common roots, but I never mentioned my experience. I also went around and I went to the Buddhists, I went to the Hinduists, I went to the Gnostics, I joined several sects, and I asked around, hey, have you ever had an experience like this? I merged with the light, I went to this dark void, and no one could tell me that they had experienced that. So that was really something that worried me. Also, when I tried sharing my story with my family, my friends, they thought I was crazy. I was imagining it. And I had no explanation. So I decided to not mention it. I only mentioned it to those people who I thought could give me an explanation. So the years continued to pass. And one day, I'm a journalist, I met another journalist who had written a book. She was from Spain, and her book was called 24 Minutes on the Other Side. And she hired me. She wanted me to translate it into English and publish it in Amazon. So I said, okay. I started reading it. I found that she had also been in this dark place, that she had also seen the light, merged with the light, and had also what she called 360-degree vision. So I talked to her and I told her about my experience, and she said, look, you were in the place that near-death experiencers call the void. You met the light, you had 360-degree visions, and I don't know if you had actually had a near-death experience or not, but it seems like you did. So that was something I knew nothing about. I had seen Raymond Moody's, the movie about his book. That was basically all I knew, and that had been many years before that. So since I'm a journalist, several months passed, and I started looking for other people. I started watching YouTube videos, and I started looking for people who had had near-death experiences. And I set up a YouTube channel. I started interviewing people, and I found not one, but several people who had had exactly what I had while being clinically dead. Some of them, apart from my experience, they also met deceased loved ones. They went to heaven. They had other experiences, but others basically had what I experienced. So I decided to interview researchers. And after interviewing several people who had had a near death experience, I ended up meeting researchers like, I think the most important is Raymond Moody, Eben Alexander. I also met Pim van Lommel, PMH Atwater, and Dr. Melvin Morse. Dr. Melvin, I had the fortune of sharing a lot with Dr. Melvin Morse, who took interest in my experience. And he was pioneer researcher of children's NDEs. Now, Melvin Morse, he encouraged me to write a book about what I had found. Back then, I still didn't want to mention my experience. I started sharing my experience. Now, this was really hard. A lot of people go through this. They don't dare tell anyone. And I had the fortune of interviewing Dr. Yvonne Kaysen. And after I interviewed her, she asked me a simple question. Have you ever had a spiritually transformative experience? I had never heard that term before. And I thought she was asking me, have you ever had a spiritual experience? That's what I heard. That's how I translated it. And I said, sure, I have. But I've never found anyone to talk to about it. And it's been hard. And she said, okay, let's meet. She set up a meeting. She is the head of Spiritual Awakenings International. She was also the ex-head of IANDS. So she set up a meeting, and it was like a private sharing circle in which 2 or 3 people, she told her experience. She has had 5 NDEs, and 2 other people told their experiences. And then it was my turn. So when I mentioned my experience, I felt their support. I felt that I was not crazy. For the first time, I felt understood. They hold regular sharing circles. I started going to these sharing circles, and I also started going to the IANDS sharing circles. And I started finding people who had never shared their experience. Some of them, for the first time, were sharing it privately. And I decided to share my story. And while sharing my stories, I remembered a dream. One time, the sharing circle, they were talking about dreams, dreams with dead relatives. And I remembered a dream I had had with my mother. And I realized then that it was actually a visitation because my mother had a stroke and she was 2 years in coma before she died. She never regained consciousness. And I moved away. I was living in another city. And one night I woke up and I saw her standing next to my bed. She looked younger. She looked beautiful. And I was so surprised. I said, Mother, what are you doing here? And she said, well, the angels let me visit you. And I said, what angels? And she explained to me something that really gave me an explanation of what near-death experiences could be. She told me that since she was in coma and she was not officially dead and still had a body, she was not allowed to cross to the other side. Or, people, when they have near-death experiences, they cross to the other side, but they have a boundary. They cannot really go to the place where those who never come back go, okay? So she told me it was like an in-between realm or dimension that limits with the spirit world and also with the dream world. So that was an explanation. That was an interesting explanation. And she told me that she was being kept there by angels and that she lived in a place that was like a castle or a mansion. She was really glad she was there and that she needed to wait until her body died in order to continue her journey. I had this dream around 11 years after my experience. This was in 2002. And I always thought it was a dream. I dreamt with my mother. But when I recalled that dream in one of these sharing circles, I realized that she was being kept in this in-between place between the world of the living and the world of the dead that is often visited by people who have had or who have a near-death experience. Well, that's a possibility, okay? Some people can say that it was only a dream. But I decided to believe that my mother was actually giving me some important information about the fact that this dimension is not only it's part of the spiritual world, but it's also part of the dream world. And she told me the following: you know that you can visit me? And I said, what? Yes, you have to develop your spirit body. She used this word, your astral body. You need to create an astral body and you will be able to visit me. And I said, how can I do that? And she gave me, a long instruction, included several things that I could never manage. And she died before I could ever accomplish this. I wish I would have known how to have voluntary out of body experiences, but back then I didn't. I tried and I couldn't. So after this, I wrote a book motivated by Dr. Melvin Morse about the commonalities I found in people that I had interviewed. These were people who had had what I call heavenly experiences, basically Christian experiences. I chose Christian experiences. There are other people who have experiences that have to do with other religions. But I decided to focus on a group of people who told their stories based on encounters with God, encounters with Jesus, or encounters with paradise. They had these encounters, what I call heavenly. So I wrote 9 commonalities that I found, including meeting the light, hearing God's voice, visiting the lobby of heaven and having found a limit, meeting Jesus Christ, angels, or other deities, having a life review, getting the chance to return, glimpsing the future, receiving a mission, and suffering a transformation. These 9 commonalities were the basis of my first book, Stairway to Heaven. This book was released over in January of last year. And after that, I interviewed PMH Atwater, and also in conversations with Dr. Melvin Morse, I realized something, because I was trying to find an explanation to why people have similar near-death experiences, but completely different. Near-death experiences are all different, yet they share common traits. So I was trying to find an explanation for that, and apparently the cultural background and the religious background of the people who have the near-death experience shapes the experience. However, when I interviewed Melvin Morse and PMH Atwater regarding this, they said kids age 5 or under display the same common elements. A kid, before he is indoctrinated or before he learns about religion, he exhibits these same traits. They go through a tunnel, they find a light, they meet the deceased loved ones. So my conclusion was that there is something more to this. And I started working on an explanation. I realized that this difference in NDEs is common in all mystical experiences, also in psychedelic experiences. People can take ayahuasca, or they can meditate, or they can fast for 40 days, and they can see a divinity, but this divinity will not be the same for all. A Christian, okay, more or less will see a Christian deity, a Jesus or angels, but a Hindu won't. Although some do, but the most people are affected by their, I don't know if it's genetic or the background of their people, but I compared it to the Tower of Babel that is in the Bible. The Tower of Babel was built by people who wanted to reach heaven. And God, he wanted to disperse them. He did not want them to reach heaven. So he made these builders speak different languages so they could not understand themselves. And the tower was stopped. So I said, wow, this tower, the Tower of Mystical Experiences, which includes NDEs and all these other experiences, this tower, okay, once you reach the top, you have a unique experience. Everyone has a different experience. So when they come down, they each come down talking about something different. And when they put it in words, when they try to explain to others, it's just like as if they were talking different languages. So somehow the spiritual world cannot be perceived by 3D people and directly, and it needs kind of to be translated so each person will see something different. And even near death experiencers who have several experiences, each is different. I've met people who have had 3, 4, 5 near death experiences, and each experience is completely different. It's as if they went to different places. So basically, that's my story. I think that my experience with oneness and my experience with the light gave me an explanation not only of the secret mystery of all religions, but also of the secret mystery behind NDEs, behind mystical experiences. And it shows us what many people say when they have a near death experience, that we are all one. Death does not exist. Time and space are an illusion. The story of the one that divided himself into two shows us that this is an illusion and this is like a matrix, because we are all the one having multiple experiences. We are that being that we call oneness who decided to experience everything and created duality. There is no duality if there is only oneness. So by creating duality, he created this universe, but all is taking place within his mind. This is really hard to understand, but that's my basic conclusion. And I know that quantum physics also says that everything is taking place within our minds. The universe, unless it is perceived, does not exist. And quantum physics is built around this. It's called the observer effect and the interconnectedness of everything. So there was the founder, or one of the main founders of quantum physics is Max Planck. And he wrote the following. He said, I regard matter as derived from consciousness. And he said that behind this universe, there is a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. He used that word, the matrix. This was in 1918. And he realized that we are part of that oneness. Carl Gustav Jung, also meeting with Wolfgang Pauli, he determined, or after they studied reality, they concluded that there is only one reality behind the psychic forces and the material forces. Albert Einstein called it the unified field. John Bell calls it non-local reality. The Taoists call it the Tao. We call it God. The Kabbalah calls it Ein Sof Hour. And it's this abstract, all-englobing consciousness to which we belong.